Thank you, John, and to your whole family, actually, for pulling out the red carpets in this absolutely stunning home for this talk. And thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. And I'm also glad to see many friends from Studio Incaminati and the art world here. It's great. I'm not here to represent the school so much as the larger artistic tradition that does underlie the painting that is taught at Studio Incaminati. And one of the great names in the old master tradition, especially in 17th century Italy, all of Europe knew her name then, was Artemisia Gentileschi. I've never spoken on this topic before. I pulled this together for this event, and the novelty of the idea is very exciting to me. I think a lot of us will know that Artemisia Gentileschi, if you know her at all, will think of her as a feminist. I hope you don't mind if I quote from my own book. There are a few words that she penned in letters that give us a sense of what kind of a feminist she was. I hesitated to use the word feminist because some people used to say you can't apply that to people who lived before our modern political system. But nowadays, most individuals agree that it really does apply. She said, when writing to one of her patrons, "I will show your lordship what a woman can do." She wrote, "A woman's work raises doubts until her work is seen. You will find the spirit of a Caesar in this soul of a woman. If I were a man, I can't imagine it would have turned out this way." So she clearly was very aware of the different treatment and different attitudes towards men and women in her own time. And she's obviously not very pleased with the effects that it's had for her career. And she makes that quite plain when writing to even powerful individuals of her time. So it's pretty clear that Artemisia Gentileschi is what we would call a feminist. So my question when I thought about this paper was, how does a feminist of that era think of the Catholic Church? What is her attitude towards the Catholic Church of her times? And what is the attitude of the church towards a feminist in the 17th century? So with these very innocent questions and with no preconceived notions, a lot of facts, I started lining things up, and I'm going to show you what I came up with. And I speak off the cuff, so that makes it a little bit easier to enjoy the evening, I think. These are some of my publications. So I've been thinking about this artist for many years, and my work began in the archives in Florence in 2010, and I was still working in the archives in 2020 when I began writing the book. So 10 years of archival research went into this. We know, or will know by the end of my talk, who Artemisia Gentileschi was. When I talk about the Catholic Church, though, I should clarify what I'm talking about. I'm talking about three essential things. I'm talking about the people and the individuals who represented it in their offices and in their work in the church state. I'm talking about the buildings, the physical places where you encounter the work of the church, the basilicas, the cathedrals, the parish churches, and I'm also very interested in the art that was in them, of course. And thirdly, the ideas and the beliefs. So when I talk about the Catholic Church, I'm going to move among these three different ways of thinking about how it resonated in Artemisia's life. And of course, back then, the Catholic Church is also a temporal power because of the enormous land holdings of the Holy See at that time. This area here, oh, actually all the way up there, it included Bologna and Rome and almost to the area of Naples. So it's a very large bureaucracy as well that had to carry out all of the roles of a secular state in addition to its religious work. One thing that we have the Catholic Church to thank for is a lot of the documentary material that tells us about the life of Artemisia Gentileschi, precisely because it had all of these various bureaucratic functions. It does furnish us with her baptismal records, for example. Sorry? And it tells us also about her mother's birth, her mother's marriage, and her mother's death during childbirth when Artemisia was about 12 years old. It was about at that time then, bereft of a mother, that she really fell under the influence of her father. This might not have happened if her father had remarried, if her father had had sisters or any other women in his household, but he didn't. He only had two much younger sons. So Artemisia was the sole woman in the house and the closest in age to her father, and they developed a very close bond. Artemisia emulated him and very quickly learned the precepts of painting from Orazio Gentileschi. Orazio himself was a friend of Caravaggio. Caravaggio was involved in some lawsuits. He's a very rambunctious, litigious individual, ultimately murderous too, but at this point, Caravaggio was in a conflict with another artist, Baglione, over some defamation. And Orazio is noted in the trial documents, and Orazio tries to distance himself from Caravaggio in this trial testimony, but he does admit to having loaned Caravaggio a pair of angel wings and a Franciscan's cloak. So we get a sense that these men knew each other and worked together in some way, at least as friends. And you all know that Caravaggio was very jealous of his style that he innovated, and he would attack those who were copying his style. But eventually, after Caravaggio left Rome, after having committed a murder, Orazio did begin imitating Caravaggio's style, and as he did so, his daughter was doing the same thing. Now, the question that arises is, how did Artemisia know what Caravaggio's art looked like? And the answer there has to do with what I said earlier about thinking of the Catholic Church also as a collection of art available for the public to see in its churches. These are three examples of altarpieces by Caravaggio that were well within the neighborhood of Artemisia's home, and we even have documentation that she visited the church that holds the two paintings on the right, Santa Maria in Popolo, because That's where her mother's funeral was held, and that's where she was married. But we do also know she traveled a bit around the city from time to time on feast days in the company of other women. Normally, a woman in good standing who is not a servant would not want to be seen wandering the streets of a city alone, unaccompanied. That was not good for her reputation. But we do know she traveled in a carriage and with family members to see art. Unfortunately, one of the individuals who was in the carriage with her for one of these visits to churches around the city on a feast day would later turn out to be the individual who raped her. We'll hear briefly about that. And here are two paintings that Artemisia and her father completed roughly around the same time period. We don't have exact dates for them, but they are both thinking about Caravaggio's style. And I'll leave it to your own aesthetic judgment which one is closer to the mark. But they are clearly thinking and aiming in the same direction in a parallel path. It's not that the father instructed Artemisia in Caravaggio. Both were students at the same time because the father was having to relearn art after having been trained as a mannerist painter. She made her first signed painting in 1610. There were probably many before that, but this is the first one with a date on it. And like the one I showed you a minute ago, this one, I didn't bother to say that that was a Madonna and Child, but this one too derives its subject matter from a religious text. This is a depiction of Susanna, regarded as a saint in the Catholic Church. And it's the moment when two elders in Jerusalem are trying to force her into having relations with them by threatening to defame her and have her charged with adultery if she does not make herself available to them. It's a horrible predicament, and I want to point out a couple things about this image. One is that one of the elders, being very hypocritical, because an elder is supposed to be an exemplar to the community for his behavior, and he has a lot of authority, he is holding his finger to his lips to urge her to be silent. And this is a very, very important sign because according to the law, the kinds of sense of law that we get from the Bible that would have been prevalent in this Jewish community, but also in the contemporary Roman law that applied in Artemisia's time, a woman could not be presumed to be a victim of rape unless there was proof she had cried out. Crying out, trying to get someone to come help her, was considered to be a sign that she was a victim and not willing and complicit. So the fact that that man holds his finger to his lips and insists on her silence is a legal issue, and it tells us a lot about the pressure that this young woman is under. And it also shows that Artemisia has done some research when making this painting. She wasn't just thinking about what it meant emotionally for a woman to undergo this trauma, but from a legal perspective, how does one demonstrate that Susanna was innocent? And if she didn't cry out, what might have prevented her from doing so? So it's a very interesting painting. And it does precede by a good year the rape that she herself underwent. When she went to trial, I wanted to show you what some other paintings of Susanna and the elders have looked like in the past. Tintoretto, when he made his version of the subject 40 years earlier, or actually 50 years earlier, he gives us a sense of the lechery of the two elders, but we're kind of tempted to look at Susanna through their eyes, I think. Here are some other examples by artists closer to Artemisia's period. You can see in the one by Domenichino on the right that one of the elders indeed does put his fingers to his lips, and we have a fountain there. So maybe this one was seen by Artemisia. But clearly, she was very familiar with the issue of women protesting vociferously as a demonstration of their will, and how that will would have been, that will to resist the rape would have been perceived as testimony of their innocence. The words, the speech was as important as any act of force that the woman might use. So she was, was brought to trial in Rome when her father brought charges against her rapist, Agostino Tassi, an artist who had worked with her father. And the whole trial took place under the auspices of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church ran, of course, the religious courts, but it also ran the temporal courts, the criminal courts in the Holy See, and her rapist was found guilty. And even though there wasn't really much physical evidence, if any, it was a very difficult case. There wasn't much physical evidence for what Artemisia claimed or what her father claimed. Nonetheless, she got justice, and I think she would have had a positive view of the Catholic Church's justice system and how it stood up for a woman. She did say in her testimony to her defense why she did not cry out. She explained that he gagged her when he came into the bedroom where she had been painting. So she had already become quite familiar with the legal ins and outs of the issue of rape when making her painting, and therefore she was able to defend herself and call out the crime of the perpetrator quite forcefully and convincingly when she was in trial, unfortunately, as a modern-day Susanna. She left the city of Rome very soon afterwards. It would have been difficult for her to find patronage from a noble class of men and women after this trial, even though she was declared a victim. There still was a stain against her because a man accused of rape could exonerate himself, even if he committed the act. He could exonerate himself by showing that the woman he had touched was a woman of ill repute, that she had a bad reputation. So Tassi had called numerous individuals to testify that Artemisia was a slut. And so even though that was ultimately not found to hold water, it certainly was not a pleasant place to continue living after these things had been said in court. And so many of the neighborhood men she had thought of as friends of her father had said these things against her. She was married to a Florentine man who was an expedient for her to get out of the city of Rome and to begin her career anew. And it's at this point in her art when we really see an emergence of what we're known of in Italian literature as donne forti, of strong women. And they were women who were featured in paintings and in collections of readings for young women who received their educations from convents for the most part, as exemplary role models whose own lives were a basis for modern women to know how to behave in different situations, exemplifying virtues that were especially associated with women's role, positive role in society. Now, at first, the story of how Artemisia found patrons in Rome in Florence is a complicated one. I feel like I've worked out the solution, and she got her first commissions by identifying wealthy individuals in the silk industry who were able to afford her paintings and who also liked music, because music was a pass key to the higher echelons of Florentine society, and in fact, almost a direct pass key to the court of the Grand Dukes, the Medici Grand Dukes of Tuscany. So some of her earliest paintings in Florence emphasize music. This one is a secular image, but there were religious ones as well. So there was a Saint Cecilia that almost ticked two boxes. She's a virtuous woman, painting a religious role model, a saint, a female saint. And if you like music, I'm sure you would have had enjoyed looking at the lute that is featured so prominently and realistically, and maybe even looking at the fingering, which is portrayed with a great deal of realism. And of course, we see that this woman is about to sing. So this is the new thing in Florence, which is the aria, and there's a lot of improvised singing going on, and women are beginning to sing for the first time in public in these secular situations. So it's a very exciting time for women singers, women musicians, and Artemisia is capitalizing on that. She also painted images of strong women, in this case, Judith and her maidservant. Judith is a heroine who defends her people from an army led by an Assyrian general thought to be undefeatable, Holofernes. And they've got Holofernes' head in the basket. Blood is dripping from it very slowly, but that's not the concern of Judith and her maidservant. They are in Holofernes' tent in the middle of the rest of his army encampment, and they are worried about getting out of his tent alive. She's already got Holofernes' sword on her shoulder, Judith does, and she's ready to use it again if necessary. It's an image that definitely signifies the potential militancy and deadly force that a woman can muster up in order to carry out the work of God, to save her people. I would like to point out that Judith is a widow, and that'll come up again in a few minutes. She depicted a New Testament saint several times, the penitent Magdalene, and I don't think that's a coincidence, because these two paintings that I've just showed you with religious themes wound up at the Medici court, where the Grand Duchess's name was Maria Magdalena. Mary Magdalene of the Habsburgs. So these were paintings meant for the Medici court. She's getting paid as much as a painter can possibly be paid at this time. And her women are strong. Their bodies are weighty, massive, powerful bodies. And their emotions are vivid and real. They're not repressing their responses to the world around them. They are agents. They are ready to act. And the penitent Magdalene's great act is one of conversion. We see that she, in this moment, is about to see the light, or she is seeing the light, pushing away the mirror that represents the vanity of the life of luxury she led as a wealthy prostitute, perhaps pulling off an expensive dress to embrace a life of poverty and simplicity and love of God. So this is a very important exploration of how Artemisia could unite the role of a courtier trying to impress and please a prince or a princess with some very thoughtful consideration, a very thoughtful consideration of the Christian story that she's representing. The painting on the right was also made for the Medici court, and it represents our same Judith, the widow, with her maidservant just a few minutes before that severed head appeared in a basket. This is the moment of the severing of the head of Holofernes, who had been inebriated in his own tent. When he fell asleep, Judith grabbed his sword and killed him. But in her rendition of the story, she allows Holofernes to wake up a little bit and to begin fighting back. You see him raising one hand with his fist almost clenched. And Artemisia, how would she have known what fight scenes look like? She wasn't raised in streets, able to watch men fighting and gripping. So I've suggested that she saw this particular statue in Florence, not very far from the Uffizi in the Loggia, where you see lots of bent arms and thrusting, gripping hands, and a head pushed back to the limit that could have possibly inspired her own fight scene. I also have thought about the particular sword used in this image, and I found an example in Florence. It's an executioner's sword. It's not the kind of sword that an army general carries to the battlefield, but it is one that would have been easily recognized because it was the privilege of the German guard to be executed by sword rather than hung when they committed capital crimes. So this is a well-known sword, and it indicates divine justice is being used to kill Holofernes. It's not a murder of revenge. This is divine justice. Artemisia is depicting Judith as a vessel of God's will. Now, why this painting has often been bandied about in the press or on the internet as Artemisia's vengeance against her own rapist, but I've proposed a very different theory that we know it was a commission from the Medici court, and we know it hung in the Medici court for decades and decades, and it's still seen at the Uffizi today. Why would they want something so personal and atrocious? What they wanted was an image of women taking power to defend the state from its enemies, from its foreign enemies. Why did they want that? Because at the time when this was commissioned, it was clear that the Grand Duke, Cosimo II, was very ill. And he had written out his will and determined that his wife, in the case of his death, which was very imminent, would become a regent for his son, who was not even 10 years old. And she would share that regency with his mother. There would be 2 women in power. And when do you become old enough as a boy to assume the title in your own name? At age 18. So the current Grand Duke knew that his wife and his mother would be working together to defend the state against foreign enemies for at least 8 years, while his own son grew and came of age. He could have had his own brother serve as regent, but he chose his wife and his mother. He trusted them more. Maybe he thought his brother would take the throne and put his own heirs after him. There's a picture of Maria Maddalena, and I vaguely, humbly have suggested that there's a slight resemblance between the Judith and Maria Maddalena, and there you can see the sun. So from this point of view, this image is still a feminist image, but it's now one that reflects that feminism was not counter to the interest of powerful men. Feminism could be part of a strategy of dynastic transmission of power, because women were holders of power as regents in dynasties. This is another painting that Artemisia made for the Medici, and she dated it 1620. And the foreground is a sword that looks a bit like, with the pommel, a sword that is a dagger, a hunting dagger, that the Medici still have in their collections today. And this is an image in which yet another woman, not a Jewish woman, but a Gentile, defeats an enemy of the Jewish people. So we see that God can work his miracles through the hands of a woman, even a non-believer. Quite incredible. And I think Artemisia here has taken a bit of a risk in putting the enemy soldier's hand underneath the skirt, almost to remind us of one of the sources of women's power, her seductive power. At the time that Artemisia was at the court in Florence, the Medici regents, Maria Maddalena and her mother-in-law, Christine of Lorraine, had a priest in their court begin working on a very large text about the achievements of women since time immemorial up to the present day. It is 38 volumes, it's all handwritten, and it's where I found the earliest biography ever written of Artemisia Gentileschi. And I wound up publishing it. It was quite a find. But Artemisia's own life was used as an exemplary life to give all of this evidence that women have the dignity and the nobility to rule in society. That is the ultimate purpose of these 38 volumes, to demonstrate that women were created by God. Now, I'm not stating this from my point of view. This is written in the manuscript. That women were created by God, expressly designed to not only rule over other women, but to rule over men. Yes, that is what the text said. And it was promptly put on the index of prohibited books because it was put on the index in the same way that Galileo's writings were put on the index, not so much for the specifics of what they claimed, but the basis of argumentation, citing biblical text and claiming an interpretation of those biblical texts supported certain ideas was the problem. If those ideas had been stated in a hypothetical way, it would have been okay. Ultimately, parts of this text came out in small publications, but 90% of this never saw the light of day, unlike Galileo's text. So I'm simultaneously working on a project to one day get this digitized. But Artemisia, her life in here is completely fabricated, or at least 50% of it is fabricated, no mention of the rape. It wouldn't have been exemplary if it had been true. It was more important to have it falsified so that she could become a perfect role model for other women and as an example of one of the many women who was doing marvelous things, and a demonstration that greatness it can be in the form of a woman as easily as it can be in the form of a man. In Rome, she returned after a tumultuous time in Florence. She was having an adulterous affair with a man, and that got her into some hot water. She went back to Rome, and here I think she thought about her faith for the first time from a spiritual point of view. There is an early image from her return to Rome, your left side. She takes up this theme of Susanna again, explicitly in the style of Guercino, who was in Rome at the same moment. And I think she did that because Guercino had just become friends with her rapist, Agostino Tassi. And I think she may have been sending Guercino and Tassi a message about her willingness to speak out and not be silent. She soon comes into the fold of the Barberini, who begin enjoying a long moment of power, cultural predominance, and great wealth and influence all over Europe. Beginning in 1623, Urban VIII lived a long time, to 1644, and he had two sons and a brother who were elevated to the cardinalate. Francesco Barberini, Cardinal Francesco Barberini on the right, is particularly active in the arts and is a patron to many artists like Poussin and Pietro da Cortona, Andrea Sacchi. So it's Francesco who will be very important for Artemisia's career. And in general, it seems that Urban VIII had a very favorable view of women, and several women were called to the Barberini court in various roles. I wouldn't discount the fact that one of his nephews married a very powerful woman, Anna Colonna Barberini, shown in the center. Anna Colonna lived in the same palace as Francesco, and there could be some attribution of the positive moment for women, creative women, that belongs to Anna Colonna. One of the individuals who was in the orbit of the Barberini, who may have brought Artemisia in with him, is Pietro della Valle. He was a nobleman who was disappointed in love, went to his doctor, who said he could mend his broken heart if he traveled. So he traveled. He went on a 12-year journey. He took a boat to Venice. From Venice, he took another boat to Istanbul. And from Istanbul, he went on foot all the way to, overland, not on foot, overland, all the way to, through the Holy Land to Iraq, to Persia, and he wound up going all the way to Goa. And then coming back, a different route, and he married an Assyrian Christian along the way, married her in Baghdad. She died, but he brought her body back to Rome for burial. And it must have been mummified. Let's hope. But he was very proud of his wife that he brought back to Rome. And she had been very accomplished, and he wrote a book dedicated to her, Siti Mani, and published it. So he was very, very affectionate and proud of his wife's accomplishments, and was perhaps, he did remarry right away, but he was certainly disposed to appreciate and celebrate women. He began writing sonnets with Artemisia, or rather she started writing them to him, and I discovered these with a friend in the Vatican Secret Archives, and this is being published very soon. So we did not know that she wrote poetry before this. And that's one way in which she could have gained attention at the Barberini court, where poetry was very much appreciated. Urban VIII himself wrote poetry, both in Latin and ancient Greek. She turns out to have come to the idea of religion probably because of a chance coincidence. When she moved back to Rome, to the area of Santa Maria in Vallicella, where the Oratorian movement was rooted. And this was a movement that tried to bring lay people, especially wealthy lay people, into the practice of praying together in these oratories, and music was a big part of that. But as a way of getting lay people more involved in the church. And their leader, their spiritual leader, was Filippo Neri, who had mystical ecstasies and would elevate from the ground in prayer. And he hated that would happen. He thought that it would go to his head and he'd become prideful. So he kept a little bell near him, and if any of his servants saw him falling into a mystical trance, he would ask them to ring the bell to bring him back to his duties on earth. Very humble man. But I'm sure that Artemisia went into that church because not only was there a great painting by Caravaggio, but there was also a painting that her father had made for a previous rector of the church and dedicated to him. And this is a period where I think she makes one of her most moving spiritual images of Mary Magdalene in her cave, in her own ecstasy. And we see her, we're almost embarrassed to be so close to her, as if we might disturb her trance, but her eyes are closed to us. She doesn't know that we're here. Her lips are closed. Her hands are closed. Her legs are closed. She's closed off from the temporal world. We have a sense, even though she's used illusionism to make that body seem so real and tangible, we have a sense that her reality is immaterial and in a totally different realm. And I've suggested that when Artemisia herself painted this, maybe some of these repetitive movements of the brushstroke when making those folds of the linen, maybe that became a kind of meditative repetitive prayer and helped Artemisia herself experience the peace of a retreat into a different state. Caravaggio had undertaken a similar, the same subject from a similar point of view, but when he represented the Magdalene, he gave us a sense of a woman who is almost in agony and who is very ascetic and suffering. We don't see spirituality as a release from pain. We see spirituality as an acceptance of pain. It's a harsh image to look at. And I want to suggest that Bernini took ecstasy in another direction altogether, away from the pain that Caravaggio talked about and into a realm of pure pleasure that's so intense that it's often seen as an erotic kind of pleasure. I wouldn't be surprised if Bernini had seen Artemisia's painting and taken it to a conclusion that is unthinkable had Artemisia not intervened after Caravaggio's model. Venice, we again see a sense that she's interested in the penitent Magdalene. And here I'm showing the painting that I'm very proud to say brought me in touch with the Shanks family and ultimately to Philadelphia. This is an image that a subject she treated before, but now we see that she's combining the notion of the penitent Magdalene with the Magdalene in ecstasy, the Magdalene who has begun penitence and has already begun to experience the absence of pain by retreating into a spiritual world, closing her eyes, closing her mouth, and shutting off her senses. I wanted to make this comparison that came to me. One very intriguing detail of the Shanks Magdalene is that even though she's shutting off her mind and she's shutting off her senses to the world, she continues to touch something. So her sense of touch is activated by holding her hair in her fingers. And why should she do that? How does the Magdalene use her hair in the future? She uses it to anoint the body of Christ. So it's almost as if she's letting go of hair as an adornment and thinking of hair as something she can sacrifice to ennoble and offer to the Godhead. So she may have seen that in Rome with the only other example I can think of, help me if you can think of something, where a work of a subject in art plays with their hair. Now in the case of Moses by Michelangelo, I think that playing with the hair indicates that Moses is thinking. He's grappling with an idea. It's like a nervous tick. He's deciding what to do when he sees his people sinning. He's got the tablets in his hand, and he sees that they're worshiping the golden calf, and he's irritated about that. But it's a sign of thought. It's a sign of thought. But fascinating that Artemisia is probably looking at Michelangelo. And you can see that their bodies, even the position of the bodies is somewhat similar. Naples She is going to think about the role of holy women and is going to find wonderful artistic ways to elevate them. But in doing so, she also begins to think about ordinary women. We'll get to that. This is a typical subject for Christian art, the Annunciation. One thing, and this was an altarpiece. It's the first altarpiece commission that we know Artemisia received. So she is working for the church, and her works are a significant part of the liturgy. This is a painting done by another Neapolitan artist at about the same time, and one striking difference that means a lot to individuals at this time is the relative positions of heads. The primary way of according someone else greater status and dignity is to lower the head, a bow, a curtsy, etc., etc. We know that that's protocol still is used today with royalty. And that is what is happening here. Paolo Finoglio represents the angel Gabriel as God's messenger and as an angel as having a higher status than a woman who's born a human, right? Who's born of a mother and father. Of course, the Catholic Church has a lot to say on the status of Mary. And Artemisia found a way to represent Mary's head much higher than the head of the angel Gabriel, even though Gabriel's fingertip, which is pointing to God, just barely reaches over Mary's head. But Mary is also making a gesture of humility. So if she were to stand up straight, I mean, there are these wonderful overlapping codes of humility and honor, ceding honor on the part of both. But definitely Artemisia makes Mary's role as the mother of God very clear as being the superior role. She was asked to paint 2 paintings for the cathedral of the apse of the Cathedral of Pozzuoli, and this is an important religious commission. She painted Judith, and for the King of Spain, Philip IV, the wealthiest patron in Europe at the time, she made one of several paintings that depicted the life of St. John the Baptist for a small retreat that Philip IV was building called the Buen Retiro, the good retirement, the good retreat. It was a retreat so large that he had to build a separate little retreat within the compound, the retreat within the retreat, and it was in this hermitage that he had all of the events of John the Baptist's life depicted, because he wanted to get the feeling of going out into the desert himself. This is a painting in which we see the religious history pushed into the shadow on the left. And if you're having trouble seeing that, you would have the same trouble even in front of the actual painting at the Prado. Artemisia has deliberately brought our focus to the washerwomen who are caring for the newborn child, John, here on the right, and all of the lines, the orthogonals of the one-point perspective, come to a focus not on one of the religious figures, but on the arm, the hardworking arm of this nameless, ordinary woman. And we see how they, while the father Zechariah is busy coming up with a name for John, and Elizabeth is taking a break from her hard labor and being succored by a maidservant, the ones who really pay attention to John are these lowly, humble workers. And one of them is on the ground preparing the water that will cleanse the prophet who will then baptize Christ. She lays the way for the cleansing of the baptizer. And this woman here holds her clean linen cloth rolled up like a scroll, as if she knows the future, like a sibyl or a prophet. And the other women look with great marvel and hold this baby as if they are aware that this is not an ordinary child. And this is, for me, Artemisia's way of showing the most powerful man on earth that even lowly, humble women can recognize a miracle and appreciate it and come close to God. How are we doing with time? Okay. The painting here on the left is one of the paintings in which I feel that Artemisia came closest to talking about how she saw women in the church. It's Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well. The Samaritan woman, she's a woman. She is a Gentile. She is a laborer. She's carrying water back and forth to a well. And she is a serial fornicator. Jesus makes a comment to her, something about which of your husbands, because she's been with many different men. And yet, in this image, we see that Artemisia makes the two of them almost like equal interlocutors. Again, look at the level of their heads and the gestures they're making. They both look like they are interested and engaged and understanding. I'm drawing a comparison with an image of the same subject by her father, Artemisia Gentileschi, a couple decades earlier. Here, the Samaritan woman almost looks ashamed. She doesn't look Christ in the face. She looks down, and her eyes are not illuminated. She's a listener, if anything, a passive listener, ruminating. But I love the way that Artemisia has the Samaritan woman really thrusting her weight, and you might recognize that gesture. You've seen it when Raphael depicted Heraclitus, also known as Michelangelo, a great philosopher thinker. You've seen it in Albrecht Dürer's representation of melancholy. So it's a pose that is used frequently in art to represent deep thinking, profound thought. The Samaritan woman is worth that attention because she went on after this conversation to proselytize. And that's what this image brings out. It shows 12 individuals coming out of Jerusalem, the 12 apostles. They've been in Jerusalem proselytizing, but the Samaritan woman would go off to proselytize successfully herself. And she has come in this conversation, you know, that she is told by Jesus that she should look for the living water, right? The water of eternal life, not just well water. And we see an interesting comparison between the apostles who were in Jerusalem We're leaving Jerusalem, and we see her being framed against water, a big sea of water, and there is no big sea of water so close to the walls of Jerusalem. It's a geographic fantasy, but it's there to compare her to the living water. She is close to the living water, closer to the living water than the apostles themselves in this particular image. She goes to London, not for a vacation. Her father was there, but she couldn't get there without a lot of help. It took her 10 years to arrange the passports that she needed to go through all of the different countries and to get permission as a Catholic going to a Protestant court, because she wanted to come back and work for Catholic patrons. So it was a very, very challenging diplomatic process, kind of like in the Cold War, thinking that as an American you could go visit Russia and work for the Communist Party and then come back to the United States and get work at the government here. So she was sent there, actually, I and other scholars believe, on an unofficial diplomatic mission to convert the King of England, if not convert him to Catholicism, at least soften his views towards Catholics, and to, with her own work there, add yet one more Catholic body to the entourage of Charles I's wife's court. His wife was Henrietta Maria of Bourbon, a French Catholic. Rubens had just been making the ceiling panels for Whitehall's ceiling, and it was thought that this was a good time to begin integrating yet additional Catholics into the visual art of the English court. One of the artists that was interviewed for the process, we have documents, letters from Galileo mention it. Galileo was present. To have Francesco Barberini, the cardinal, interview this Florentine artist, Anna Maria Vaiani, for the role of being a female artist that would be a Catholic representative of the Barberini court for Henrietta Maria. I don't have specific evidence that Artemisia was interviewed, but I think it must have happened, because Anna Maria Vaiani was not sent, but Artemisia and another female artist, Giovanna Garzoni, did go. This self-portrait is still in the Queen's, was in the Queen's collection, and she wound up painting a smaller, helping her father finish a smaller version of a ceiling like Whitehall for the Queen's Palace at Greenwich. She made one painting that I think needs to be redated to the English period, and it really cements what she did as a diplomat. It represents a religious story from the Old Testament, Esther, before her husband, the king of Persia, Xerxes. And Esther is secretly a Jewish woman, but at the same time, for a while, Xerxes' minister has been persecuting the Jews of Persia. It is a very close parallel to Charles I, whose ministers are persecuting Catholics in England. Esther wanted to go to court and ask her husband to have mercy and protect the Jews from these persecutions. And that is also what Henrietta Maria was seeking to do with Charles I. So this is a very, very important painting because it is an allegory with contemporary political relevance. Here's a picture of the couple in question, and there were many political prints made at the time symbolizing their marriage as a marriage that would bring peace to Europe, which is why they're exchanging olive branches and laurel crowns, the peace between Protestants and Catholics. Now, as you heard from our preamble before I started talking, that peace did not last, and the tensions came to a head with the English Civil War. Charles I was, first Henrietta Maria was found guilty of treason in 1643. Her husband was beheaded in 1649, and she escaped. But Artemisia went back in 1640 to Naples, preceding all of this. We're coming close to the end. I think that shortly after she came back to Naples, she thought about this time she had been with her father. He unfortunately died only 2 months after her arrival. She stayed for another year in England, but she saw her father buried in a foreign land and was not able to have enjoyed the reunion for very long at all. And I don't know what his state of health was, but it couldn't have been good. She produced at this time a religious scene, Lot and his daughters, that is usually treated by artists as an excuse for prurient imagery that looks at the issue of incest with an impious point of view. This is another artist, and you can see the emphasis on the nudity of Lot's daughters and the drinking, the inebriation that's going on. And that's very typical. Artemisia did something else. Her figures are close together, but their movements are graceful and courtly. And there is wine, but there's not a lot of drinking going on. And what's as important as the wine is the bread. So the symbols of the Eucharist are given strong emphasis, and we see the 3 figures, a kind of trinity formation, lined up so that we think about the symbolism and the fact that this union was important because Lot's line would be the line that produced the Messiah. This was a strange situation, but it was necessary for the birth of the Messiah from the point of view of divine providence. And Artemisia has accorded the image its serious purpose, which is very rare. And I think she did that because for her, it wasn't just an exploration of this strange line between the sin of Sodom and the perversion of Sodom and the goodness of these people who are doing an act that otherwise would be sinful, with these incredible demonstrations of trust and closeness and respect. And here we see Lot's daughter looking in his eye, not to seduce him, but to admire him. And I wonder if Artemisia, having left her aged father so recently, wasn't thinking about the last time he touched her, and the good aspects of being the daughter of a man who was known to be very irascible and difficult to live with. I just suggest that this is the only sign of wine or drunkenness, and it barely stains the white of the daughter's shirt. Just barely. It's translucent. It doesn't really touch her. It is an apparent stain, not a real stain. And there's a quick glance at Artemisia and her father from a book that was published later based on drawings made by someone who knew them both. And I'll skip that in order to talk about her final painting. She did not know it would be her final painting. It's the final painting that we have a date for and that survives. It could be that there are later ones floating around, but we think of this as her final painting because that's our knowledge of it. And it's that same subject we saw before, Susanna and the elders. And as always, one of the elders holds his finger up, but this time Susanna is speaking. Her mouth is open. Artemisia, I want to suggest, spent her better part of her career giving voice to the strong women, the virtuous women of the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church gave Artemisia a platform to be heard. Now, I've talked a lot. You've heard plenty from me. And the last thing I'll say is thank you.